if you guys had a chance to look, today's topic is, again, this whole month we're all about money raising and everything that goes into it. And one of the most common questions we have is, how much money should I raise and when? And so we figured that, we'll take an opportunity for our uh, opportunity, for our 45 minutes today. Today will be a slightly shorter one, to talk about, how you go about thinking when you're ready to raise money, how much should it be, right? And kind of the process and the timeline. So I wanted to start off, and obviously Michael, who's raised a bunch of money back in the day when building his business. Hi, Michael. Welcome.
Hello.
Tell us a little bit about how, especially back when you were building your company, which wasn't that long ago, but how did you know how much money to raise? Because I feel like that's such an important question for entrepreneurs, because if you ask too little, that's not going to get you. If you ask for too much, the investors are going to think that you don't really know what you're doing, right? And I know that decision probably carries a lot of criteria, right? As we like to say, what inning you're in. And so, all yours.
Afternoon, everybody. Well, I think it's more complicated than that, right? There isn't any correct answer because, Victoria, as you started to allude to a little bit, right, there's a bunch of factors that go into it. So anybody that tells you that the right amount of money to raise at a certain stage is always X is just not being candid with you. And the reason that I say that is that, if you think about, take something like Uber, right? If Uber had gone out and raised, $50,000, they wouldn't be Uber, right? They might be a little car application in Portland, Oregon, or wherever, right? But they wouldn't be there are. So there are. So a lot of it has to do with the vision you're trying to realize, right? Where you're trying to go. If you're trying to create a lifestyle business, we have 10 employees and the like, that's one plan. If you're trying to create the next Uber, that's another plan, right? And so the decision about how much to raise really should be laid against the decision of where you're trying to go. So I'll take you back to, and we're fortunate enough to be working with so many companies over the last, 5 years of Lonely Entrepreneur that we see all these different types of scenarios, and everybody always wants the magic answer that at 6 months, it's always this amount of money. And that's not the case. So I will take you back to, the reason why I think we refer back to my experience with my healthcare company, which was a brand new industry, brand new company, really complicated industry, a lot of the things that everybody, deals with here. And, our vision was really big. Our vision was really that every healthcare company in the world was going to need to use incentives to drive behavior, or you wouldn't be able to drive, the changes in healthcare behavior. Even today, President Biden about 2 weeks ago came out and said we should pay every American $100 for getting a vaccine, right? So our vision was that right, wrong, or otherwise, that people were not self-motivated in many ways and needed to be motivated financially to be able to do it. So when we talked to investors, we had a big vision. So we had a plan of, okay, how much are we going to need to raise? And we felt like we're going to need to raise probably $30 million. Now we did it in stages, right? And so we did a couple $100,000 of friends and family, and then we did $1 million round, and then we did a much, much bigger one. But you could have easily said in the beginning of my company, going to the most, innovative venture capital firms and said, I want $50 million in the beginning. You absolutely could have done that with my company. And, so there isn't this magic answer of what's the right money. It's what's your plan? If your plan is to sell your company for $1 billion, that's a different plan than you want to hire 3 people and keep it. And so how fast you want to grow is one of the major factors that dictates how much money you should raise, right? The other part of it is valuation, right? Because, for example, if we were to go out in my old company and say, I want to raise $50 million without anything, without, customers or product or whatever, the discussion is going to be, well, if you raise $50 million, how much of your company is somebody else going to own, right? You haven't built up enough parameters, right, of your company, or foundation of your company, I should say, to justify a large valuation. Now, many people at those stages actually get larger valuations because the vision's so big. So it would have been fun to try the conversation of, we don't have much, but we want $50 million and you own 10% of our company because this is going to be worth 10 billion. Like, that would have been a fun argument to make because you could see the opportunities that existed. But part of it is, okay, if I'm trying to do something big, right, you've got to raise a lot of money quickly, right? And then you should just fight the fight with investors about what the valuation is, right? And you're going to give away a big piece of your company. And in that case, you are talking about potentially, owning a smaller piece of a very large pie. A couple of examples, there's a couple of companies out there, Teladoc, MD Live, American Well, these are the preeminent telehealth companies in the country. And, telehealth is obviously incredibly prevalent these days, even pre-COVID and now post-COVID. And those folks, raised $100 million and got beaten up along the way. Doctors don't want to do telehealth and it's going to take away from the business. And now people are like, of course we need telehealth. Those guys raised $100 million, but did it painstakingly in a bunch of different things. So, it relates to how quickly you want to grow. It relates to what valuation you want to get. Do you want to build your company a little further along and have some traction, right? But when you do that, right, it goes slower, right? It takes time to build traction. It takes time to build a product, build a service, build a customer base, right? Get some notoriety. And it's a chicken egg thing. You're like, oh, that sounds great, Michael, but don't I need money to do that? So a lot of times what people do is we'll get a foundational round of capital in early, could be a couple $100,000, could be, even to get started, $50,000, right? And then they build on that. But right after that, they're turning back to raising more because they ultimately want to, again, and I'm talking for the most part about a bigger vision, companies that have bigger visions. And that's not to necessarily say that big visions or small visions, there's nothing wrong. Your vision has to be true to you. And it's perfectly fine that vision is, as I like to say, one pizza stand. It can be a very fulfilling, rewarding business, right? But if you're doing bigger things, right, the amount of money and how quickly you raise it is ultimately will dictate how quickly you can go, right? And sometimes people say, well, somebody said to me that I have to have more traction to raise money. There are plenty of companies that have raised money with very, very little because the vision is so big, right? More companies have made progress, shown evidence of progress, right? But I know, for example, in my company, when we had made some progress, we certainly had not made enough to, if you look purely at the numbers, to justify the valuation we got. It was the opportunity, it was the market opportunity and the role that incentives were going to play. And obviously our unique approach to that. So I think the first and most important thing you need to be able to do is to build your plan. Where am I trying to go? If I could paint an ideal picture, where am I going to be in 3 years and 5 years? Do I want to sell the business for a certain amount of money? And then you work yourself backwards. If you said, hey, I own an accounting firm and I want to sell it for $25 million in 5 years, you'd be like, great. How do accounting firms get valued? Well, they get valued at 10 times earning. Great. How do I have the earnings in 5 years I need to get to that? How does that work back and say, how many accountants do I have to hire, salespeople I have to hire? And that's the money I need to do it, right? And you may look at that and go, okay, that plan works. And okay, maybe I take that fundraising and split it into two pieces. I do a little at first to get me moving, and then I do more later to get it going. Okay. The other part of this is, Victoria alluded to it, and she's using some terminology that we use at Lonely Entrepreneur called knowing what inning you're in. I'm an old baseball guy, so I use stupid sports analogies, and knowing what inning you're in is trying to predict in something that you're doing that is innovative, how far along is the market? Like, is the market ready? Right? Because if you raise too much money too quickly and the market's not ready, you'll burn through that money. Do you have to eke into the market, or can you, through the force of capital and having more resources, can you force the market, right? Can you flood the market with sales and marketing and visibility in a way that the market is going to do it? For example, you look at a company like Chewy, where many people get their pet needs met. Chewy raised hundreds of millions of dollars and still to this day loses hundreds of millions of dollars to saturate the market with a new and different place. Well, you already had Petco and PetSmart and Amazon, and Chewy was like, well, if we're going to get there, we have to get there with a lot of capital in the beginning. So knowing what inning you're in is super, super important. And if you're like, well, listen, the market's ready, I got to go after it, you may have to raise more capital more quickly, right? If you're like, well, I got to eke into this because the market isn't ready yet, and I got to be out in front of it when it is. And that's a really hard thing to do. It's hard to actually predict. We at Incent One, my old healthcare company, we were ahead of it for a while. So, we were selling into a market that not only it didn't exist yet, but we had to almost create it. And it took some time to do that. So the one thing I want everybody first and foremost to walk away from is that the people advisors that are advising people, and for those of you turning to advisors, the advisors know there isn't a magic answer to this. And it's really a matter of aligning these factors to your personal goal, your financial plan, and what that vision reflects. And then ultimately, what valuation, how much of your company you're willing to give away. And secondarily, knowing where you are against when the market is ready for your product and service. In many cases, especially for smaller businesses, the market's ready right now. It just has to be, what you're doing has to be brought to market to show your unique product or service. But when it comes to more innovation, so for example, if Uber had come about in the year 2005, right? Well, the same concept applies, right? The convenience and price competition and all that kind of stuff. Well, would it have worked in 2005? Would people have been open to getting in a stranger's car? I don't know. It doesn't seem like it would work back then. So, had they done that then? Now, the stories that you hear for all of these different companies, many of these different companies, is that, well, they struggled for years and years and years, right? Because it's difficult to predict what inning you're in. And for leaders of companies that have vision, which everybody here and a lot of entrepreneurs obviously have, you have to marry that vision with where you are, right? And what often bridges the gap between your vision and where you are is capital. You can get there quicker with a larger amount of capital. I know when, I get to hear about, and my team gets to hear about lots and lots and lots of innovative ideas. There are some ideas that you hear about that are really good ideas that you can kind of build into. And there's other ideas that are so interesting and innovative that, and when you hear them, you're like, that needs a lot of capital because it deserves the capital to bring it to life. Or if capital isn't deployed aggressively, it won't get there because somebody else will do it. Somebody else will get there faster. Okay. So those are all the factors that go into the decision of how much to raise. The other factor is a little bit of your network, right? Although, as I'm saying that, there's always folks that are out there to raise bigger money that can help you do that. So your network matters a little, right? In terms of, okay, friends and family and others that you might raise money from. And you might say, well, that's all I could raise. Well, not really. If your vision is big enough, you can certainly go to third parties that raise money all day long and can put you in touch with people that have a greater access to larger types of capital. I think I don't call it business school answer, but the business school answer to the question, how much capital should I raise might be something like, well, the amount of capital that gets you to your next major milestone that impacts the value of your company, right? So give me enough capital that gets me to the point of the next big step. because at that next big step, I can go raise more capital, but because I've taken that step, I can raise it at a valuation that is higher. Okay, so let's say it's, built the product, right? Well, we're raising a little bit now, and that money is really being used to build the product, because when we build the product, we've got a lot more, right, foundation, and therefore the next money we can raise is going to be done with at a higher valuation, because the company has more, more to it, if you will. Okay, let me stop right there. I'd love to say that there's a magic number, but anybody have any questions, or if any of the basic concepts that I'm talking about here in terms of valuation and those types of things need more explanation?
Folks, and please don't be shy about asking questions. We want to be able to, especially with a, semi-smaller group, want to be able to get into it. So Ed has a question. Do you have any examples or links to third parties that raise capital?
Yeah, there are no shortage of third parties that raise capital. What I would do is I would look in your local area, or I would look to people that have raised capital in your sector or industry. There are tons and tons and tons of people that will, help you raise capital. Now, there's a couple of things that go with that. Number one, usually that when you go to a third party to raise capital, it's usually, at least $1 million, if not more, right? And usually cases much more. Secondly, normally the compensation structure for those relationships are, they get a piece of the capital they raised, usually anywhere from 6 to 8% of what they raise, they get. And especially for earlier stage companies, there may be a retainer where they ask you to pay them, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month to get you into the market. And a lot of times that money is then offset against the 6 to 8% if they ultimately raise it. So, there's no shortage of companies that will do this for you. You got to find the right one. And what I would do is I would search in and around your industry. I would search in your geography. You want people that have raised capital in and around your industry to be able to do it. Okay. Keep in mind that raising capital with a third party, there's a good and a bad to that. The good is they should be able to open up their Rolodex, if you will, and be able to talk to people they've talked to before. That's one of the reasons you've hired them, and you get kind of a warm introduction to places. The bad news is a lot of times those parties don't do as good a job as you would do in communicating your story. So you have to be there, and some of them are great at it, but you have to be there with them. And the materials that you use have to be really tight so that when something does get put in one of their relationships, now the fact that the relationship is there is great. And that's what gets you in the door to have the conversation, but it is not a magic bullet by any stretch of the imagination. Okay. Another question, or should I keep going?
Oh, good.
Terrific. So when you think of ultimately your decision to how much to raise and when, and you've taken the time to put together that kind of couple-year financial plan, and you work yourself backwards from that, right? Then you say to yourself, great, I need $100,000. What's my plan, right? And part of that has to be, okay, there's a difference between raising $100,000 and raising $100 million, right? In terms of who you go to, how you approach it, the types of investors that you go to, right? The people that invest in, technology solutions and innovation are likely the different people that invest in real estate, for example. So when you think about who your target audience is relative to your amount of money, at the smaller levels, you may be talking just friends and family, certainly angel networks, but even within the angel networks, right, there are slices and dices of different sizes, different industries. And there are, lots of different tools. I would encourage you, in your local geography, almost every major city now has a online angel networks where you can tap into the folks that are that will give you an indication of the investments they've made, how much they invest in, the industries they invest in, and probably most importantly, the stage they invest in. You know, do they look at pre-revenue companies, companies that are just getting started, and or are they looking more exclusively at companies that are a little bit further along? Okay. Before you go and raise that money, you need some of these foundational elements that we've been talking about, right? So a 3-year financial plan, which lays out, you know, your income and expenses and profitability and capital needs over the course of a couple of years. Secondly is an executive summary. This is a document that's got, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 pages. The shorter, the better. That shows, you know, your business and the fundamentals of your business. And then an investor presentation, investor deck that is similar to the executive summary, but expands more on, you know, all of these different functional areas around your business. Okay. And when you think about who it is that you ultimately approach, and with the amount that you're approaching them with, that also has to be tailored, right? So if you're talking to friends and family may be interested in investing because of the issue that you're working on. They may be interested in investing because they know you, right, and have good faith in you. Whereas when it comes to pitching to more, let's call them formal investors, could be angels or venture or even bigger, right? A lot of it's going to be a more sophisticated analysis around the market, your unique approach to the market, and obviously the ability for the business to take advantage of some of that market to create a company with a bigger valuation. Right. So who you pitch to matters. What the message to that group is different. For somebody that you're raising $25,000 from versus $25 million. And you have to be able to decide, or should be able to decide, okay, given the plan that I have, I need to raise this amount of money. And with this amount of money, this is what I'm going to do with it. And I think that's a particularly important element of this, which is, how do I have regardless of the money you pick, regardless of the amount of money you pick, right? Have I built my financial plan that reflects what I'm going to do with that money? Okay. And a lot of times the following will happen. You go into a meeting with investors and they'll say things like, well, you've communicated that the market you're going after is really, really big. You know, why are you only raising $250,000? And there's the temptation when that happens, because again, the amount of money you pick is not an exact science. But there's a temptation to be reactive to that and say things like, well, the market is bigger, we could certainly raise a lot more. But remember, what people are looking for in the leader of a company is to basically say, you've made a decision about how much money you want given your plan. You've built a financial plan, right, around that amount of money. That's our plan. Like, that's what we've decided to do, given all the factors that we talked about before, valuation and how far along you are and what inning you're in and all that stuff, right? So because it's not an exact science, the temptation is to responsibly say, well, we're gonna raise X or Y or Z, or we could raise X or Y or Z. And I strongly encourage you not to do that, because investors want somebody that has thought through it, that has decided on the amount of money they want to raise, and that has built their plan, right? And to say, you know, we're raising 250,000. With that 250,000, we're going to be able to deliver on the financial plan that you have in front of you. Now, if somebody says to you, I'd like you to consider that, you know, we're investors, we really like what you're doing. We only write checks of $5 million or more, have you considered, or would you consider a bigger raise? You can certainly take that away and think about it. But I can tell you what I would not do in the middle of an investor meeting is say, oh yeah, 250,000 or $1.5 million. Yeah, we could do either. Right? Because then investors just go, well, what's the plan? You're supposed to be the CEO. What's the plan? Is it 2.5? Is it 250? Is it 1.5 million? How do you make that decision? Like they want to have somebody, they want to hear from somebody that has thought this through, built a plan and said, this is what we're going to do. Okay. Presumably you as the leader of the company have come to the table and said, I've picked this amount of money and I've built this plan for a reason, right? You didn't just flip a coin. You built it for a reason, and therefore the plan in front of you is the plan. Remember, you're going to get criticized for all this. You get criticized as too much, you get criticized as too little, right? And all the above, so it doesn't really matter. So anyway, David, did you have a question?
I do have a question because I watch Shark Tank too much. But obviously, the amount of money that you're asking for versus the percentage of the company you're willing to put on the table implies a valuation of what you need. And my question is, in your experience, how strict is that as far as investors are concerned? I mean, are they more willing than we would think, or you would see on Shark Tank, to invest based on a growth plan as opposed to a strict current valuation, of net income? Because most of the businesses I work with are smaller businesses who, if you do it a valuation that way, they aren't going to be able to raise much money.
Mm-hmm.
But they have big plans and need to raise a lot of money to take that next step. So that's kind of the,
yeah. Listen, David. This is the dilemma, right? I think what it ultimately comes down to is, the basics of a business always are informative, but in a lot of cases, in the early stages of especially really innovative companies, they lose money on purpose, right? They're supposed to lose money. If you went to a venture capitalist and said, I'm going to create the next Uber and we're going to try to make money in year 2, they'd be like, no, I'm not interested, because unless you're going to lose $50 million a year, like Salesforce lost $100 million a year for 3 or 4 years. Because their investors wanted them to either get there or not get there. So what I would say, David, is that first and foremost, painting the vision for the opportunity is the most important thing. Now, that opportunity might just be in your neighborhood. It doesn't have to be, the world. It might just be that in our neighborhood, we're going to be the best X. And that's the most important thing, because think about us when we would evaluate an investment, right? Unless it was just a company that was making $1 million a year and you're like, I'm buying that, I'm just going to buy that. And then you just know exactly what it is. That's not most of the companies we're talking about here. We're talking about companies in the process of building, right? If we all here had a bunch of investments put in front of us, we would evaluate first and foremost, what is the opportunity? What is the size of this market? What is it that we could ultimately realize and be a part of? So I'm going to open up a ski chalet in Park City, Utah. Okay, well, what is the opportunity? There's other ski chalets. Is it growing? Can that turn in X to Y? That informs how interested we get in it, right? Then you go down into, okay, how is this company taking some unique approach to it, right? What traction have they gotten already before I give them my capital? What have they built, right? And who's the team involved, or the people that I'm going to be able to give to? So I think that and those, David, those can change. What I should say is the opportunity can change the dynamic a lot. I always use the silly analogy of the house you really want to buy, right? If you really want to buy that house, then your rule about, well, I'm going to always do 20% below asking price goes out the window, right? Because you've decided you want it, and then you work your way backwards and so the most important thing is to get people excited about it. And when I say excited about it, I don't just mean viscerally. I mean, what's this market opportunity that you're going to be able to take advantage of, right? And the valuation that you ultimately get is partly based on where you are, right? And your growth plan. But some of it is also based on where you potentially could go with capital, right? And this is where it also comes down to the type of investor that you're talking to, right? There are some investors that are like, I've invested in real estate, I get rent every month, I make this, like those people are going to be able to be like, and again, I'm generalizing, but what are you doing? What are you going to do tomorrow and the next day and the next day? And how are you going to increase rents by X and Y and Z? And that to me is the way I think of investing. Whereas there are others that are looking at, where could you go with this, right? How much bigger can you go? And if you can paint, and when I say paint, when you can help them internalize that idea, like rewarding people for being healthy, right? What we used to say is that there's $20 trillion of spending on healthcare in the US. Some smart people out there said 75% of it is preventable, right? So if people just did the stuff they're supposed to do with their health, right? If the diabetic went and got the annual checkup, if people stayed on their medications, 75% is that is preventable, right? So I use the analogy that caused us to start the business, right? 10 pregnant women, right? For every 10 women that don't follow their prenatal care, it costs the healthcare system $1 million, right? A woman doesn't detect something early enough. When she has her pregnancy, she has a problem, kid ends up in the ICU, boom, $1 million, right? So you're like, wait a minute, if it's 10 women, $1 million cost, why wouldn't you give these 10 women $10,000 each? Okay. So when we painted that and we said, well, 75% of this $20 trillion healthcare cost is that stuff, right? To be honest, David, like what we were doing at that point shouldn't have even mattered. Like, shouldn't even matter. If I was $1 million company or it shouldn't have even mattered. It's like, do you believe that I'm the guy that if you give me your capital can bring that to life? And when I say I'm the guy that's going to hire the rest of the guys and gals that with your capital do it. But because the vision was so big, what we were doing today had less relevance. I can always get 3 customers to do this. And that's a little bit of evidence, right, of traction. We all get, like, we create the cookie business, like everybody loves our cookies. So all of our neighbors buy our cookies. Well, they might buy them anyway. Like investors are like, I taste the cookies. Do I love the cookies, right? And do I have a team that understands how to do this? So I always believe that getting people to really internalize the opportunity, right? Local, regional, national, whatever it is the first and most important thing that dictates how much you're going to have to give away when you raise money for a company. There's also a vehicle out there, and I'd be interested, anybody here, called a SAFE. It's called a simple agreement for future equity. And it was created by an incubator called Techstars. And what a SAFE recognizes is that in the early stage of a company, it's very, very difficult to value the company for all the reasons we're talking about here. And so what a SAFE does is essentially puts the money into the company. It goes into kind of a placeholder, and it actually becomes equity or ownership the next time the company is valued. And when does that normally happen? Another financing, right? Another financing happens down the line. And therefore the people that put the money in the beginning, that's why it's called a simple agreement for future equity. That money converts to equity at a little bit of discount to the valuation in that next round. So it's trying to address that issue that, how do you determine what Uber was worth in the beginning? I'm sure the founders of Uber said it was worth $1 billion day one, right? And investors say, we love this idea, but it's not worth anything right now, right? So I think that painting the picture of the opportunity, right, and having people kind of internalize what those opportunities, like I think I did with respect to, my health rewards business. Once you come from that, then you're just in a much better position that regardless of the amount of money you're raising, and it's never regardless of how much traction you have, right? But depending on how compelling your ideas in the market is, raising money, even in early stages, becomes easier if you're able to get people to really viscerally connect to that market opportunity. Make sense?
Well, that was great education. Thank you.
Now there's certain other types of businesses that are more, nuts and bolts, right? If you're opening up a supermarket, it's probably more, right? How much you have to sell and how much margin do you have, and right. Much more nuts and bolts type of stuff. And that's where I can't stress enough how important it is to talk to the right investor,
Mhm.
right? If it's so important.
Yeah, in this case, I'm thinking of a business that is a product manufacturing business,
Mhm.
and they need to expand production capacity.
Yep.
And they need capital to do that, believing that there is a big market for
Yeah.
expansion.
Do they, so that's where you try to be a little bit creative. Are they growing?
Yes.
So if they're growing and they're getting orders, quote unquote orders,
Mhm.
right? There's ways to finance around that as well, right? To be able to use the revenue and the accounts receivable and some of those things to try to, whether it's,
Mhm.
accounts receivable financing, bank financing, obviously depending on what stage they're at and how they're doing. There's some ways to do that. Sometimes there's been great examples in the manufacturing area where people actually do deals with their suppliers, right? They're a little more complicated, right? Because then you're really in bed with your supplier. But usually if you're getting revenue, right, and that revenue continues to grow, there are third parties that will recognize that. And as long as the business is doing okay and growing, equity financing isn't always the way to do that. A lot of times that's where accounts receivable financing and other, asset-based lending and other types of financing vehicles are being used.
But you've given me a great outline here for how to approach pitching that business to anyone. And I think I really appreciate the thought of, you have to remember who you're pitching to and why that person might be motivated to invest. So.
Yeah. And especially if David, if you've got a situation where you have the demand and you're growing,
Mhm.
right. And it's there even before you've invested capital, right. Or their capital. You're basically putting gas in a car that's already driving and it just wants to drive faster. Right. I mean, those are the harder investments when people have to put money in to build things, right? I got to build the car. And that's where it's harder because then you're investing in just making the sausage, if you will, and you just haven't proven that the sausage sells yet. Whereas it sounds like your client is somebody that's, onward and upward, just doesn't have the capacity to support it.
Absolutely.
Good problems to have. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Any other, I know we've covered some questions here. There's a whole section within the learning community about raising capital. Any other questions that people have? I know we got to cut short a little bit today.
Nope, I think we've answered a lot of questions along the way. This was definitely very informative and insightful. And Eden, I don't know if you had a chance to see, but I posted the link to the recorded coaching session. So once, usually we upload these, within 48 hours, but the previous ones are definitely in there. So check them out. And looking forward to seeing everybody next week. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, guys.